Welcome, gentle traveler. You've arrived at Snooze Scholar, where stories unfold slowly, thoughts drift like clouds, and truth is never rushed. Tonight, we are not crossing oceans or chasing kings. We are walking barefoot through the warm, dusty streets of ancient Athens, a city alive with voices, merchants shouting prices in the agora, poets reciting verses under fig trees, and lawmakers arguing beneath columns of white stone. But there is one voice that stands apart. It does not shout. It does not command. It asks. Softly, calmly, endlessly, it asks. You see him there in a plain robe, old, bearded, a little strange. He walks slowly, never in a hurry, and he does something most people find deeply unsettling. He listens. His name is Socrates. He is one of the most famous philosophers in history. But he never wrote a word. His thoughts come in the form of questions, not to show off, not to win, but to discover, gently, together, what's hiding beneath what we think we know. He's not rich, not powerful, not even very clean, some say. And yet, his quiet persistence shakes the very foundations of Athens. Because when you ask the right questions, even gods and governments begin to shift. But this is not a story of rebellion. There are no riots, no swords, no revolutions. This is a story of stillness, of one man who stood so firmly in what he believed that even when the city turned against him, he did not run. He did not beg. He simply accepted. Tonight, we will drift through that story, through his youth, his ideas, his trial, and his final calm moments. There will be no rush, no urgency, just the gentle unfolding of a life shaped not by answers, but by the courage to keep asking. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let your mind rest where logic meets silence, and where, even in death, a philosopher whispers, the unexamined life is not worth living. Long before the streets of Paris filled with cafes, before the skyscrapers of New York stretched into the clouds, before electricity hummed beneath our cities, there was Athens, not the marble ruins we know today, quiet, sun-bleached, crumbling with time, but a living city, breathing, buzzing, and very much awake. It is the 5th century BCE, and Athens, in its golden age, is a city of contradictions. It is both a cradle of art and a den of politics, a place of beauty and tension, order and chaos. The streets are narrow and winding, not planned but grown. Stone houses lean into alleys, their windows shaded with cloth. Children dart barefoot between pots and pillars. Dogs bark. Vendors shout. And above it all, on a rocky outcrop known as the Acropolis, temples glint in the Mediterranean sun, including a brand new marvel of white marble, the Parthenon. But Athens is not just stone. It is sound. Everywhere, voices overlap. Men debating in the agora, the central marketplace, where business and philosophy collide. Farmers argue over fig prices. Sculptors talk of proportion and symmetry. Playwrights, like Euripides and Aristophanes, recite lines under their breath, rehearsing before the next great festival. In the law courts, citizens, not lawyers, make their cases, speaking with passion before a jury of hundreds. In the theaters, the stories of gods and mortals blur together in masks and poetry. Democracy is young here, experimental, loud, often messy. Any free male citizen can vote, debate, or even stand for office. But with freedom comes anxiety. What if the people choose poorly? What if the wrong voice is the loudest? Athens is powerful, yes. Its navy rules the Aegean. But it is also fragile. It is a city balancing on the edge of greatness, nervously watching for cracks in its marble. And in the midst of all this, there is a man, old, barefoot, bald on top with wild hair at the sides. He carries no scrolls. He owns no home of luxury. He teaches no class. He just walks and talks and listens. Some call him strange, others call him dangerous, but most just avoid him, because this man has a gift, or perhaps a curse. He can ask a question so simple, so calm, that it leaves the most powerful minds in the city quietly unraveling. This man is Socrates. And though he speaks softly, Athens will never be the same because of him. He has no written works, no memoir, no scrolls etched with his thoughts. Everything we know about Socrates comes from others, from students like Plato and observers like Xenophon, who tried in their own ways to capture a voice that refused to write itself down. And maybe that was the point. Socrates didn't want to say what to think. He wanted to ask, and let you walk the path for yourself. He was born around 470 BCE in a modest Athenian household. His father was a stonemason, his mother a midwife. And that metaphor of birthing things gently, with care and pain and patience, would follow him for the rest of his life. Not as a doctor of bodies, but as a midwife of ideas. He was not beautiful, not noble, not wealthy. Accounts describe him as short and stocky, with thick lips, a snub nose, and eyes that didn't quite focus where you expected them to. He often wore the same rough cloak. He didn't bathe regularly. He walked barefoot, even in the heat of summer or the bite of winter. But those who spoke with him couldn't forget him. He had a strange kind of magnetism, not in appearance, but in presence. He was fully there, calm, still, attentive in a way that made people uncomfortable. Because once Socrates began to ask you questions, you felt seen, and then slowly exposed. He claimed to know nothing. He insisted on it, and it was sincere. He didn't see himself as a teacher. He saw himself as a fellow traveler. Just as lost, just as curious, just as flawed. The only difference, perhaps, was that he knew how little he knew. And in that awareness, he found something like peace. Socrates never charged for his conversations. He didn't write a philosophical school curriculum. He wandered the city, markets, gyms, courts, porches, asking questions to anyone who would speak with him. He questioned generals, artisans, poets, priests, and especially politicians. He wanted to understand what made someone wise, or good, or just. And when people gave easy answers, he asked again, not to trap them, but to peel back what was shallow and reach what was real. To Socrates, truth was not a possession, it was a process. And perhaps that is why he became dangerous. Not because he told people what to believe, but because he made them see what they believed might not be as solid as they thought. Athenian youth began following him, not because he offered certainty, but because he offered honesty. And that honesty was infectious. But not everyone admired him. To the powerful, Socrates was a mirror, one that could not be broken and refused to lie. And in a city already wrestling with war, fear, and pride, one man with no title, no wealth, no army, was quietly becoming a threat. Imagine speaking with someone who never raises their voice, who never says, "You're wrong," who never mocks or shouts or storms away. Someone who simply looks at you, nods, and says, "Tell me more." That was Socrates. He had no interest in debates scored by audiences, no thirst for winning. He wasn't trying to destroy his opponents. He was trying to find the cracks in certainty and walk with you through them. The technique he used would later be called the Socratic method. But to Socrates, it wasn't a method. It was a way of breathing. It begins with a question mark, simple, unthreatening. What is justice? What does it mean to live a good life? What is courage? The person he questioned, usually someone important, a politician, a poet, a general, would offer a confident answer, something neat, something practiced. And then Socrates would ask another question. Is that always true? What about this case? Does that apply here too? Not to embarrass, but to explore. And slowly, gently, their answers would begin to bend. What seemed solid would grow soft. What seemed certain would blur. Until even the wisest man in the room was left quietly admitting, "I don't know." And that was exactly what Socrates was looking for. Because for him, wisdom didn't begin with knowing. It began with admitting you didn't. To not know something was not shameful. It was sacred. It meant you were awake, ready to learn, ready to peel away the stories you'd been told, and find something more real beneath them. The Socratic method wasn't about proving a point. It was about burning away illusion, slowly, calmly, like fog lifting over the sea. But not everyone appreciated this feeling. It was disorienting to have your beliefs unspooled in the middle of the marketplace, to feel like you were sinking in your own logic. And Socrates never gave you a hand back up. He would thank you, smile, and walk away. He left people humbled. But in a culture obsessed with pride and rhetoric, that humility often curdled into resentment. Why does he ask so many questions? Why won't he ever say what he believes? Why is he always circling? To the powerful, it felt like sabotage. To the youth, it felt like freedom. To Socrates, it simply felt honest. Because he believed that living well meant living examined, not blindly, not comfortably, but truthfully, even if the truth came slowly, painfully, and never fully at all. Most philosophers write books. They sit in quiet rooms. They teach in marble halls or lecture from elevated platforms. Socrates did none of that. He taught on foot. He lectured in alleyways. He debated under olive trees, next to bread stalls, or leaning against the crumbling steps of a city shrine. He had no school, no robes of distinction, no title to introduce himself with. Just questions and presence. He would rise with the sun, quietly, with no grand routine. He bathed irregularly, if at all. He wore the same rough cloak, regardless of the season. He ate little, often bread, olives, and water, sometimes nothing at all. But his hunger was for conversation. He walked slowly, deliberately, sometimes alone, sometimes trailed by a small group of young men, eyes wide, hearts burning with the thrill of his simplicity. Not because he told them secrets, but because he made them feel something rare, honest thought. They would ask him questions about gods, love, justice, death, and he would rarely answer. He would ask them back. And then, like water circling a drain, they would all be pulled into a spiral of words. Gentle, thoughtful, unsettling. Sometimes they'd sit for hours, just talking, letting the city move around them. Other times, Socrates would wander into a conversation already happening, between two merchants arguing about fairness, or a general boasting about bravery, and quietly insert himself. He didn't do it with arrogance. There was no shouting, no insults, just simple, probing calm. So, he might say, "What is fairness?" Or, "Do you think courage is the same in all situations?" The moment he spoke, the room shifted. He asked things most people never thought to ask. And once asked, they couldn't be ignored. That was his power. He made you think, when all you wanted was to believe. And yet, he never claimed superiority, never claimed wisdom. In fact, what made him different was his commitment to not knowing. He claimed to be the wisest man in Athens only because, unlike the poets and generals, he knew that he knew nothing. He did not lecture. He lingered. He let silence do its work. Even when provoked, he remained composed. He did not retaliate. He only asked again, and it was this refusal to fight back, to engage on anyone else's terms, that made him at once maddening and magnetic. In a city that measured status by wealth, war, or bloodline, Socrates had none. And yet he was everywhere, in the courts, in the gymnasiums, in the dreams of young men and the nightmares of old politicians. He was a man who owned nothing, and yet his presence was priceless. He had no doctrine, no shrine, no end goal. He simply believed that to live was to seek, to live rightly was to question, and that the soul, more than the body, needed daily nourishment. Not from wine, not from bread, but from conversation. Athens was a democracy, a radical idea at the time, rule by the people, for the people. But even democracies get nervous, especially after a war. The Peloponnesian War had shaken Athens to its core, a long, bitter conflict with Sparta that left the city bruised, broke, and suspicious. The streets no longer buzzed with easy laughter. They whispered now about traitors, about weakness, about who was truly loyal and who might be tearing the city apart from the inside. It was in this uneasy atmosphere that Socrates continued walking, still barefoot, still questioning. But now, people were starting to listen differently. His questions weren't just unsettling, they were beginning to feel dangerous. He had no clear allegiance. He wasn't part of any political party. He had students and admirers on all sides, even among those who would one day betray the democracy. Most notably, there was Alcibiades Dash, a brilliant, beautiful, charming young man who had once been Athens' golden boy. He had studied under Socrates, walked with him, listened. But Alcibiades would later switch sides. Defect? Plot? Flirt with tyranny? And then there was Critias, another former student, who would go on to become one of the cruelest members of the 30 Tyrants, an oligarchic regime that briefly overthrew the Athenian democracy after the war. Socrates never endorsed these men. He never plotted. He never raised a hand in violence. But the association was enough. In a time of deep anxiety, nuance fades. Guilt becomes a matter of proximity. People began to whisper, "Why does Socrates question the gods? Why does he corrupt the youth? Why won't he just say what he believes?" To the Athenian mind, shaped by civic pride and traditional values, Socrates' endless questioning began to feel like erosion, not of truth, but of unity. And then came the formal charges. In 399 BCE, 3 citizens stepped forward with an official accusation. Socrates, they claimed, was guilty of 2 things: impiety, disrespecting the gods of the city, corrupting the youth, filling their minds with doubt instead of devotion. 2 charges, simple, but heavy with implication. This wasn't just a legal complaint, it was a warning. To question too deeply was to become a threat. And Socrates, He didn't flee. He didn't hide. He listened. He nodded. And when the court date arrived, he stepped into the courtroom. Barefoot, calm, unshaken, ready not to defend himself, but to speak his truth, not for survival, but for clarity. The courtroom was not like ours. There were no lawyers, no powdered wigs, no gavel-striking wood. In ancient Athens, trials were public, noisy, chaotic. 500 jurors, ordinary citizens, sat in a large open space. They were not judges of law, but judges of people. And this time, the man standing before them was not a thief, or a soldier, or a foreigner. It was Socrates, a man many had seen in the marketplace, a man they had heard or heard of, the barefoot questioner, the gadfly, the quiet irritant of the city. He stood in plain robes, no emotion, no apology, and when given the chance to plead for his life, he did not beg. He spoke softly, clearly, and without fear. He did not deny the charges. He reframed them. He said he had never claimed to be a teacher, never charged money, never claimed wisdom. He described himself as a gift from the gods, a gadfly sent to sting the lazy horse of Athens, to keep it alert, honest, alive. He told them the uncomfortable truth, that virtue matters more than wealth, that a city must care for the soul of its people, that unquestioned lives are not worth living. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity. He questioned his accusers with the same calm he used on kings and merchants. He made jokes, light, dry, almost whispered. But the air was heavy, because beneath the humor was something unshakable. He believed in what he was doing, even if it meant death. He could have pleaded, he could have cried, he could have promised to stop. But instead, he challenged them. He told them that silencing him would not silence philosophy, that others would rise, that questions would return, that the voice inside them, the one that wonders, doubts, and seeks, could not be executed. And then, the vote. The jurors dropped their tokens into urns, black for guilty, white for not. The result? Guilty, by a narrow margin. And in Athenian law, after a guilty verdict, the defendant and accuser both proposed a sentence. His accusers asked for death, execution by poison. Socrates? He suggested he be rewarded, that he should be fed at the public's expense like an Olympic hero. The audience laughed uncomfortably. He smiled, then offered a chance to avoid execution by proposing exile, or a large fine, or silence. He offered only a small sum, joking that his friends would help pay. He knew what would follow. And so, the court sentenced him to die. No outburst, no shock. He accepted the judgment with the same composure he'd brought into the room. And he waited, peacefully, for the day he would drink the hemlock. Not with dread, but with understanding, because for Socrates, the purpose of life was not to live at all costs, but to live in alignment with what is right. The sentence had been passed, death by poison. But in ancient Athens, execution was not immediate. There was a sacred delay, a religious festival during which no state executions could take place. And so Socrates waited. He waited in a small jail cell, with a stone bench, a narrow window, and often the sound of footsteps above, as Athens carried on, unaware or unwilling to think too long about the quiet man waiting just beneath them. Friends visited him daily, Plato among them, young, earnest, writing everything down. They begged him to escape. It would be easy, they said. The guards were sympathetic. The route was planned. Gold had been gathered. All he had to do was walk away. He could live in exile, teach elsewhere, grow old with his family. But Socrates refused, not angrily, not stubbornly, but with that same peaceful conviction that had followed him all his life. He said that to escape would be to betray everything he believed. He had lived by Athenian law, and now, even though that law had failed him, he would not abandon it. If I run now, he said, what was the point of all those questions? He believed in a deeper justice, not just one written in stone, but one lived with integrity. He had spoken his truth. He had been judged, and now he would accept the consequences. His calm wasn't fatalism, it was freedom. A freedom that came from knowing that even in death he was aligned with his conscience, his principles, his purpose. His cell became more than stone. It became a final classroom, a sacred space for final conversations. He spoke of the soul, of virtue, of what comes after death, not with fear, but with curiosity. He told his friends not to mourn, that a good man has nothing to fear from death, that perhaps it was a kind of sleep, or perhaps a journey to a place where the wise would meet and speak forever. And so he waited, not pacing, not trembling, but still, until the day came, when the jailer entered quietly, holding a small cup filled with a bitter liquid. Hemlock. And Socrates, without resistance, took it in his hand. The day was warm, quiet. Soft light drifted through the narrow window of the prison cell, falling across the stone floor like spilled silk. A few of his closest friends were there. They sat on the ground, not speaking much, just being near him, as if their presence alone could slow time. Socrates had been talking all morning about the soul, about the possibility that death was not an end, but a kind of release, a return dash, to a purer state of being where truth was no longer hidden behind bodies and senses, but seen clearly like sunlight through clean water. He spoke gently, calmly. He asked them not to cry, Not because death wasn't sad, but because it wasn't bad. To Socrates, the soul was the true self, eternal, thoughtful, seeking, and if the body was only a temporary vessel, then letting go of it was not to be feared. When the jailer entered, he looked embarrassed, ashamed even. He had grown to admire this old man, and now he had to hand him the cup. Socrates took it without hesitation. His hand was steady. He asked what he should do. The jailer explained, "Drink it all, then walk around until your legs feel heavy. When you lie down, the poison will begin to work. It will rise from the feet upward until your heart slows and stops." Socrates nodded, no ceremony, no drama. He held the cup. He said a brief farewell. And he drank, not quickly, not bitterly, just completely. And then, as instructed, he stood. He walked slowly, a few circles around the room. His friends watched, some weeping quietly, some frozen in place. He smiled. He told them not to grieve too much, that death was either a dreamless sleep or a conversation with souls who had gone before. He lay down, he covered himself with a blanket, and the jailer, crouching beside him, touched his leg. He asked, "Do you feel anything?" Socrates answered, "No." The poison was working. Soon he could no longer feel his legs, then his abdomen, then his chest, and as the cold reached his heart, he spoke one final sentence. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt." It was a strange thing to say, but Asclepius was the god of healing, and perhaps Socrates meant that death itself was a kind of cure, a healing of the soul. And with that, he fell silent. No cry, no resistance, only stillness. He had lived asking questions, and now, in death, he had become the answer. The cell is empty now. The hemlock has done its work. The friends have gone home. The sun has dipped behind the hills of Attica. But Socrates remains, not in body, not even in writing, for he left no scrolls, no signature, no monument. And yet his presence echoes through time, not loudly, not with fanfare, but like a quiet question you can't stop thinking about, because something strange happened after his death. He grew in memory, in legend, in philosophy. Plato, his student, wrote dialogues where Socrates was always the calm center, asking, guiding, revealing. Through these writings, Socrates became more than a man. He became a method, a way of speaking, a way of thinking, a voice that whispers in classrooms, courtrooms, and quiet moments of doubt. And it's not just the wisdom we remember, it's the posture, the way he stood still while the world rushed by, the way he refused certainty even when others begged for it, the way he smiled gently at the idea of death. Not because he didn't value life, but because he valued truth more. Socrates taught that philosophy wasn't something reserved for books or elites. It was a daily act, a discipline of the soul, a slow, deliberate peeling back of illusion. He showed that courage isn't always found on battlefields. Sometimes it's in staying seated when everyone else is standing, in asking why. When everyone else nods, yes. He died without anger, without regret. And in doing so, he gave us something more powerful than any lecture. He gave us an example. That it's okay not to know. That doubt is a kind of devotion. That silence can be sacred. And that sometimes the best way to change the world is simply to ask it a better question. So sleep now, gentle listener. Let the city of Athens fade into starlight. Let the sound of sandals on stone grow quiet. Let the old man in the plain robe walk slowly out of view. And remember, the unexamined life may not be worth living, but the examined one, the quiet, thoughtful, uncertain one, is worth falling asleep to.